Hey everyone, welcome to a new episode of Unstructured Unlocked. I'm your co-host, Michelle Gouveia.
And I'm your co-host, Tom Wilde.
Tom, so this one's going to be a little bit different. I feel like I haven't had a chance to just catch up with you and talk for a while because you've been on, I'll call it your press tour of guest podcast appearances and the conference circuit. So for today, what I was hoping to do is just pick your brain on a topic that's been coming up in a lot of the conversations we've been having with other guests, and I think that you've been on the road talking about, which is this shifting landscape of AI, obviously specifically within insurance, because AI changes very quickly, but I think
Yep.
also the appetite and what we're seeing is also changing pretty rapidly. So before we get into that specific topic, though, I do want to just ask you, what is the decision era? So when you talk about that, what is the decision era, and why do you think that it's resonating with the audiences and the people that you're speaking to?
I think it starts with the fact that, and I've said this, even on other podcasts and speaking engagements, that insurance really is in the business of decisions, right? So if you think about what they do, carriers decide about what is the right risk for them to take on, how to price that risk. All of the catastrophe modeling is about a decision as to what could happen in the future. How to adjudicate claims is a decision, right? When you get a claim in front of you. So I think that that's always been true of insurance. But what's happened is now we have this convergence of AI and compute power and data, which means that we have sort of unprecedented ability to make decisions with way more context than we ever could before. And that's a really exciting opportunity. I think the challenge there is, how do you wrestle that to the ground and make it an advantage and not a disadvantage? And that's really how we think about, this framing of the decision era that has just begun now.
Got it. Got it. And I've heard you use the term enterprise decision supply chain.
Yeah.
Can you just go into a little bit more detail about that?
Yeah, this has really resonated with customers that we've spoken to. And the gist of it is, we really propose to customers to think about, if they agree that we're entering this decision era, it mandates that you think about those decisions as the finished good, right? So that ultimate decision is the finished good. Okay, so if we use that metaphor and extend that metaphor, you can then apply sort of decision supply chain concepts to it. So let's work backwards from the finished good, just like we would if we were thinking about, an iPhone sitting on our desk. Think about everything that is behind the creation of that iPhone, that landed on your desk, all the way back to the very rawest of materials that go into that. And not only the materials, but also, if you use the physical supply chain metaphor, the labor practices and the environmental regulations, all the things that also surround the creation of that thing, that finished good. You can apply those to an end decision, right? So what's my raw material? Most of the time in insurance, it's unstructured data. What happens to that unstructured data from the moment it hits that email inbox, which is typically where it starts, all the way to the finished good, which is, okay, we're going to quote this risk and bind this risk. And so you can deconstruct that into the many piece parts that make up that decision, that finished good.
I love that. I think that's an awesome metaphor, and I can understand why it's resonating. And I guess maybe that's a nice transition into kind of the first topic that I wanted to cover with you, which is the advancement in thinking, or the new metrics for return on investment that carriers are focused on. Way back when generative AI first hit, the day-to-day for everybody,
Yeah.
everyone was just saying that the main metric was accuracy, right? Or efficiency. And it was hard to quantify that because a lot of carriers couldn't even tell you what their accuracy rate was beforehand, or,
Yep.
they wanted something more accurate, but they couldn't exactly tell you was accurate enough. And so I'm curious how those conversations have shifted, if they've shifted with carriers, specifically when we're thinking about using AI for underwriting or claims workflows. Like, what are going back to your supply chain metaphor, are
Yeah.
there different ROI metrics in each of those categories that in aggregate make it make an easier decision, or just how are people thinking about it today?
Yeah, I'll kind of describe the more challenging modes of this and the success, modes that I've seen for this. The more challenging modes, which are quite common, is that a lot of carriers have looked at the sort of decision supply chain without really thinking of it that way and have optimized for each piece of the process. Think of those as like vertical slices, right? So they've got a team that's only focused on that one piece, and they built a lot of a sort of one-off technology to optimize that one piece. Think of it as like back office stuff, and then you have like the front office stuff. And they kind of have seen those historically as two different worlds, back office and front office. Those are very challenging modes because the teams typically aren't well integrated, and no one's looking at the overall end-to-end outcome that they're trying to achieve. So a lot of the carriers are struggling with that, right? Legacy systems and teams that have focused just on one piece of this at a time. What I'm seeing now is a recognition that, hey, we should tip these vertical sliced, optimizations into a horizontal pipeline view of the end-to-end process. So the word end-to-end is coming up a lot in our conversations with customers and prospects. The outcome of thinking about it end-to-end is it forces you to think about what is the outcome we're trying to drive. Let's really focus on, and a lot of times I'll say this to the customer: if this is successful, how will you measure that success? How will you walk down the hall to the CFO and justify this investment? How will you expect to be measured on it? That forces the thinking around the end-to-end outcome, which then naturally leads them to have to rethink, okay, we can't just focus on these slices of the problem anymore. We need to think of this more holistically.
And do you think that the stakeholders are coming into the conversations with those expectations, or do they need to be coached on how to think about AI use cases and outcomes, and what are the real ROI metrics to focus on?
I think the challenge is, let's use underwriting as an example. Well, let's start with claims actually. I think the claims world is much more leaning in on AI enablement of the claims process. I think that claims adjusters have, in my observation, been more welcoming of automation and getting rid of data entry and using AI to sort of make decisions around emails received and things like that. These are good uses of Gen AI that we've got in production. On the underwriting side, carriers are coming out of like a 7 or 8 year run of great profitability. The underwriters, if you ask them, they'll say, well, there's not really a problem to solve here, right? It's working. We don't see that there's a problem, A. And B, I think they have been burned by, technology solutions that haven't come from them, that were supposed to improve their day-to-day, that they would say hasn't.
Mhm.
So there's some both skepticism and a lack of a sort of belief that, hey, this is a problem to solve. So those are sort of the individual perspectives. Now, the institutional perspectives are, shoot, the underwriting workforce is aging. They're going to retire. We have a lot of individual knowledge of these very experienced people that we haven't been able to codify as institutional knowledge to make this process more tailor-made, to take advantage of AI. A lot of times, a friend of mine at the Hartford would say that it's a race to the starting line, right? And I think that's a really great metaphor, that you have to understand your data and your process first. That just gets you to the starting line. That is not the finish line. But if you don't run the race to the starting line, you're going to never be able to start the actual race here. And so there's this real kind of grinding of gears as customers try to get that race underway to the starting line, so they can then set themselves up to really take advantage of this.
Yeah. And do you think that maybe the size of a carrier or the technological leaning of a carrier impacts that? I think there used to be a bigger disparity maybe between like the tier one carriers and the smaller, maybe more regional carriers, in terms of feeling if they could get to that starting line even. But to
Yeah.
me, that seems like it's blurred and everyone's kind of on equal ground, just because of, even if you didn't go through a big transformational core system project, you've got these vendors that are doing these low code, no code, or these Gen AI solutions that can help get you there. Is that, are you seeing that in the market too?
Yeah, I think that all these companies have their own DNA, right? In terms of build versus buy and where they think they're going to build competitive advantage. And so it's hard to say there's a kind of a universal feeling about this. I think that Gen AI is a great leveling of the playing field from a technology access standpoint. I mean, to be honest, any 12-year-old today has access to as powerful technology as, a
Yeah.
Fortune 100 does, which
Yeah.
is sort of mind-blowing. So the landscape has shifted, but there's a bit of a paradox here because you can now build proof of concepts very quickly, but it turns out like that's not really the problem. The problem in the enterprise is how do you maintain it? How do you test it? How do you add features? You need a product management discipline. How do you make sure that it is secure? How do you make sure that it is governable and can meet the needs of regulations, which are, increasing every day, especially if you look at, say, New York State, which is probably the extreme today in terms of insurers and their requirements to explain, the use of AI, within their processes. So I think there is a little bit of a trap here where just because you can build a prototype with Gen AI and make it compelling, no argument there, you can
Mm.
do that. There's a bit of a lack of understanding that, that is the very first step in a very big process to deploy enterprise grade technology and keep it deployed. I think that's the other key thing is it's not just building a use case and getting it launched. I always say it's like having a kid, right? Like you have to feed that child and educate that child and that's a lifelong commitment. So when you build something, you really have to believe you can sustain that approach, which is why vendors are valuable because we get up every day and all we do is obsess over this problem that we've identified as interesting to solve day in and day out, right? Like it is for us, existential.
Yeah, I think you nailed that because that emphasis on once you build it, you have to maintain it. And I'm
Yeah,
not trying to say that carriers don't think of it that way, but they're like to your point, there's whole businesses doing this. That is their day to day. And to think that you
right.
could pull one or two people off of their day job to support this off the side of their desk just doesn't work. And to your point, keeping up with the regulatory environment changes is just it becomes a monster to try
Yeah.
and manage inside of a carrier. Do you think that because we've heard some like it's very easy for carriers to see a vendor presentation, especially one I think now that leverages AI in some component of it and say it's a very easy question to ask, well, what prevents me from building this? I've got all my data. I've got all of, the expertise and the decision making. I don't need you to come in and train something. I've got that data.
Yeah.
What prevents me from building it? And I think the top of mind answer is it's really, really hard to build it. And then I think to your point, just keeping it going. So do you think that I feel that over the past like 10 years or so, that build versus buy decision making has maybe leaned a little bit more towards the buy, you know, before Gen AI. And now it's starting to shift back into I think we can build it. And so do you think Gen AI being so broadly available has kind of rekindled that build mentality that we kind of have to work back out of a little bit?
I mean, yeah, I mean, I think the great debate here, and I stole this from something I read on LinkedIn. I can't remember who said it, but I like the analogy. The great debate here is are these large language models? Are they saws? Are they carpenters? Are they architects? Like, what are they? Because if I hand you a saw and I say, Michelle, I need a house in 6 months, maybe you could do that for me. I don't know. Like, you could certainly cut wood with it.
Mhm.
So let's take it up a step. Okay, let's say that, you are an experienced carpenter. I say I need a house in 6 months and you're a carpenter. Well, I imagine you're going to start asking me questions. Well, how many bedrooms? One story, two stories? Like, do you own any land to build this on? Have you got the permits to build this house? Do
Mhm.
you have financing for this house? And then if I said, "Whoa, you're actually an architect," well, great, you can design me a fabulous house, but are you going to be able to build it and will it be structurally sound? So I think there's like this, no one quite knows what this thing is yet. There's some promise that you could describe I want 3 bedrooms, 2 stories, modern, and it could, design that and connect it to a 3D printer and maybe print it. I mean, these are all like possible future outcomes, right? To use this particular metaphor. My team always says I love metaphors. I do. So I think you can squint and imagine that's possible, for example, in insurance. Can I just show, an agentic AI solution someday in the future, 5,000 submissions and say, "Hey, work it out," and come up with the quotes for these and send them to the agents that submitted them? Yeah, and could I feed it you know, my risk appetite and all those things? I mean, I think you can squint and see that, but there's also a chance with AI to make bad decisions faster and at greater scale than ever seen before. So that's the paradox here, is if you get it right, yes, that's possible. If you get it wrong, you could have, a $10 billion book of business that it's guaranteed to lose $10 billion. So we don't quite know how to figure that out yet. It's fascinating, and if you squint, you can see both futures. But I like the saw carpenter architect question. And I'm not saying I have the answer, by the way. I certainly I've seen people try all three, and we're neither of those three are accurate yet.
Hmm. Interesting. You mentioned you use agentic AI, so now I want to shift to that
Yeah.
as a topic because that is the new emphasis, the new buzzword. What do you think is the interest or appetite from carriers to use agentic AI? Are they excited about it? Are they curious but hesitant about it?
It's very early days. I
Mhm.
mean, I was in a meeting last week where I brought it up, and the person I was talking to said, "What is agentic AI?" So, I mean, that just gives you a sense. This is a very senior person at a huge carrier, right? Who's
Okay.
not in the technical team.
Mhm.
So that just gives you a sense of, yes, it's sort of creeping into the zeitgeist, but you have to be careful of the circles you're traveling in, because outside those circles, it's not, right? They have a company to run.
So
So,
maybe
yeah,
thinking about our audience from your perspective, what is agentic AI? Let's just get it out.
yeah. Agentic AI, to me is the orchestration part, right? Agentic AI is a series of agents intelligently orchestrated together to solve a goal. I think the vision for agentic AI is they can adjust their behavior based on some kind of goal seeking. That's not true yet today.
Okay.
It's a promise, but it's not yet true. And there's a real question, and again, I don't have the answer to this yet. I have some opinions, but there's a real question as to whether generative AI can actually do this. Generative AI, the G in it, the generative part, is a feature, not a bug, but you have to understand how it's behaving. It is giving you its statistical next best guess as to what it's seen in its environment. That's different than being intelligent. So it doesn't have a basis of truth about the world, which is why if you ask it the same question twice, it'd probably give you two different answers. It is running through the nodes within the neural network, and subtle differences may mean it passes your answer through a slightly different set of nodes than the last time you asked it, and so
Mhm.
you're going to get a different answer. So insurance is funny, right? Insurance is in the business of probabilities. At its core, it is in the business of probabilities. Actuaries are the original data scientists trying to
Mhm.
figure out this great question of, how do I take something that is inherently probabilistic and make it deterministic? Probabilistic means, what do I think the loss is going to be on this risk? And deterministic is, what should I charge for it so I can make a profit? So this is not new to insurance, this world of living between probabilistic and deterministic. When you introduce AI to it, though, you now have other probabilistic outcomes that AI is producing that you have to think about, because like any probabilistic system, a probability times a probability is an increasing probability, right?
Mhm.
You're getting a widening scope of possible outcomes, not a decreasing scope of possible outcomes. That's a tricky thing to navigate with AI and agentic AI.
So that was, I think, super helpful, and I always love hearing you break down generative AI because I think it's a really valuable viewpoint and layman's terms way of understanding exactly what it is that you're using. Do you think So taking away the example you gave of having to explain to someone what agentic AI was, do you think that whether or not the Gen AI is ready to do this, that
Yeah.
customers are ready for that capability? Like, do you think there are use cases that they're eager to have this deployed on or test on, or is it still very much trying to understand what it can do?
To me, the near term tractable application of agentic AI is around things like next best action, right?
Mhm.
So given this, what's the next best action that you would recommend to me of a set of possibilities, right? So we've got that built into our product with some nice results, in the early days here. So for example, based on the submission from the broker, should I respond to that broker with a request to complete the missing information? Should I, augment this with third-party data and pass it down to the underwriter? Like, what should I do with this thing next?
Mm,
So reducing clicks, reducing, the sort of cognitive load on the underwriting operations team just to keep things flowing more quickly and with less effort. So that's tractable. You can train agents to do that still with human in the loop, right? I think as you build trust in that particular agent's decisioning, you can start to say, okay, I'm going to set this to straight through processing and I'm going to
yeah.
trust it, right? Because there's enough guardrails and bounds on this particular step in the process that I'm okay pushing it through. I see two kinds of customers here in the market, and we have two kinds of customers. It's kind of fascinating. One set of customers says, I want the AI to be as strictly accurate as possible, as early as possible in the process. So I'm going to spend a lot of time making sure that it is as pristine as possible. And there's a lot of work that has to go into do that. And expense, right? Work equals somebody's effort.
Mhm.
Either they're paying for the effort or they're doing it themselves. We have other customers who say, I want to get to good enough at the first part of the process, get it through the system as quickly as possible so that I can make a set of triaged decisions which don't rely on strict accuracy. It's my rough cut so that I can kind of narrow down what I'm focusing on and put that in front of the people, who have experience to make those next set of judgments. Maybe that can be automated too at some point, but probably less so right now. There's less appetite for that.
Mm.
So we see both, and I think that I've seen success with both, right? I mean, it kind of depends on how you want to run your operations. We have a very large customer who is like, nope, just push it all straight through, and we'll deal with it downstream if there's any errors. And we have other customers who have invested a tremendous amount of time getting to really comprehensive accuracy on like hundreds of fields of data. I don't know who's right or wrong yet. It's just a decision you make as to where you want to, apply human in the loop and the decisioning in the process. So we'll see. Those are two different races to the starting line, in my opinion, that people are running.
Um, Bear with me because we haven't had a chance to catch up like this in a while. So I've got a few more questions for you.
Yeah.
One of them is I just love to get your opinion and thoughts on uh, there are so many vendors or solutions out there that now bring AI to the table for carriers or brokers or agents. And in some of the with some of the partners that we have, one topic that comes up is, for lack of a better framing, I'll call it AI fatigue. And it's this internal question that a lot of these innovation groups have, or even business unit leaders that are trying to deploy is, um, do you look for a single vendor that's maybe more generalized that can apply multiple use cases to AI? Or do you try and find AI vendors that are very niche or very focused on one specific workflow or automation type and try and string those together to then make a larger, full AI workflow. And just curious what you've seen or your thoughts on that, because obviously carriers can't partner with 100 different, I mean, maybe they could, but don't want to partner with 100 different companies and have to maintain those. But, it is a debate that's happening, I think, a conversation that's happening.
I think it comes down to It's a good question. I think it comes down to deciding, kind of one or two things, maybe more than two, but there's certainly two big ones that jump to my mind. One is the vendor showing up with a particular unique advantage in data that you can't get after as a customer, right? So they have some kind of data advantage that you don't have access to, and they give you that advantage. Or is the vendor is the vendor's understanding of the problem and their execution of the solution to that problem deeper than you can get after in any reasonable time frame. So if there's a data advantage, it typically is a point solution. It will require you to have a bit more of a build or integrate capability as a carrier to take advantage of that. Other questions arise from that, which is who actually owns the intellectual property? Because is your data becoming part of their product?
Mm.
How do you secure that? How do you wrap that with intellectual property rights? So that's a good news, bad news kind of story. They have a data advantage you don't have, but is your data becoming part of their product? Um, and there's decisions to make around that. And then there's of course, security too. Like is my data secure? Even if I'm okay with how this vendor's using it. On the other hand, if the vendor has a very strong point of view on the problem, let's call it, and by problem, I usually mean a business problem, not a technical problem. They have a very strong point of view on the business problem, underwriting automation, claims automation, broker reconciliation, bordereau, and delegated authority. These are kind of business problems that use technology. Um, and that vendor has a deeper understanding of that problem because they solved it repeatedly across the market in a way that would take you a long time to build all the piece parts and solve that. And back to our earlier point, by the way, maintain it forever if you build it, then that's a different way to go to market. Now the considerations there are, okay, well, I'm using this vendor as a system of record now. That's a pretty intense partnership. So I better make sure, you know, I understand the way that partnership will work in terms of who's going to deploy this, who maintains it, who measures its success, and how what are the proof points that this vendor has actually solved this successfully? What are the proof points that I'm betting on them to be, in a sense, an outsourced R&D capability for me? So how can I ascertain that not only are they solving it today, but usually when you bet on a system of record like that, you want to see 3 to 5 years from now, are these guys going to be still leading the pack? Essentially, when you license a system of record from a vendor, the bet is as much on that as it is on, can it solve my problem today? Or it should be, I should say.
Yeah. Helpful. Thank you for humoring me on that one. I'll wrap it with one of our favorite types of questions for all of our guests, a predict the future kind of question. Where, looking into your crystal ball, I'll call back to a few of our older episodes, in your crystal ball, where do you think the real competitive battleground for carriers is, over the next 2 to 5 years?
I think generally for any company in the world now, and they'll come back to carriers, I
Mhm.
think you have to think about a set of a few things in terms of how you're going to compete. I think that one is, and none of them are technology, by the way, none of them. So one is the context. Do I have a unique context for the problem that's going to give me a sustainable advantage? And how do I maintain that, unique perspective on the problem, which is embodied in this context that informs how I'm going to solve it? So I think that's a really a possible and important question to ask yourself. The second would be distribution. So what competitive advantage can I build around knowing where the buyers are and their behavior and how I'm going to create advantage there? So in the insurance world, that's all about, distribution in terms of brokers, et cetera. Not only that, but am I smarter than the next person at understanding who the best distribution points are in my world and making sure I'm optimizing for that and avoiding adverse selection? So I think those are both, two critical points to consider here. The third would be, this one isn't talked about as much, but if we think about, let's use the underwriting paradox here. We've got these very skilled individuals, very tenured, very experienced, that are going to retire. I need to now rethink how I'm going to staff my underwriting function, with a new set of folks, to do that. So I have to now think about what do they look like? What do they expect? And I think what they expect is that I'm not going to rekey information into three different systems three times, right? You're not going to get a 30-year-old to understand intellectually why the hell do I
Why?
have to do that?
Yeah.
That will just blow their mind, right? And not in a good way. So is one of the new battlegrounds competing to deliver the most elegant and, um, sort of empowered workforce using technology as another means of competition, because the technology is accessible to everyone, but that's a different kind of context, which is I'm actually going to swivel around here instead of looking at my customers, which is an obvious place to start, or looking at my distribution, another obvious place to start, but swiveling all the way around to my team and saying, I'm actually going to compete by making them as supercharged as anybody in the market. And that's how I'm going to compete. And that's how I'm going to drive down my combined ratio, because I'm going to make them, I'm going to give them superpowers. So that's kind of an interesting one that we're scratching at, because very much what Indico does is deliver this bionic arm experience to claims adjusters, to underwriters, and give them these superpowers. The sort of gravity that holds it down is legacy systems and, slices of capabilities that have to be integrated together, and things like that. So that's the escape velocity has to be like, how do we get out? How do we help our customers get out from that, sort of gravitational pull?
Excellent. Well, that is where I plan to conclude the conversation. So Tom, thanks for humoring me and taking the time to just have a chat. The English major in me loves all the metaphors and analogies that came out on this one. So thank you everyone for listening. This has been another episode of Unstructured Unlocked. I'm your co-host, Michelle Gouveia.
And I'm your co-host, Tom Wilde. Thanks so much, Michelle. Enjoyed it.